Along with extra time and lower instances of unpredictable weather, there are a variety of benefits that come with fall ESN application. Learn more at smartnitrogen.com.
All right, I am Lindsay Smith with Real Agriculture and Real Ag Radio, and joining me now is Colin Robertson. He's a former diplomat and a senior advisor to the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, and also host of the Global Exchange podcast. So welcome here, Colin.
Great to be with you, Lindsay.
All right, so it's been a busy week, let's say, in Canadian politics. Not exactly a shining example of what we maybe would like to be happening in politics. Let's start on the India file. I feel like Canada is in a very tough position diplomatically, and also, of course, just trying to navigate how to deal with the India question. How do you feel, at least from this point, from your vantage point, how we are navigating this issue with India?
Well, I think, as you say, the government's in a tough position, but I think that the fundamentals are fairly clear. There is, I think, now clear evidence that Indian government authorities, up and to and perhaps including their most senior diplomatic representative, were involved in efforts to, at the end of the day, assassinate a Sikh Canadian and harass and pressure Canadians of Indian descent. We have ongoing with now the Hogue inquiry, foreign interference in Canada, and we've of course been focusing mostly on what China might have done, but India appears to be right up there in using practices which are completely incompatible with diplomatic relations between particularly two democratic countries, and two democratic countries like Canada and India that have a long history. If you go back to India's origins as a country, Canada was instrumental in coming up with a formula that allowed India to become both a republic and then stay in the Commonwealth by recognizing the British, the Canadian monarch, as the head of the Commonwealth rather than as the monarch of independent Republican India. And then we were also one of the first suppliers of development assistance to the new republic, and Indian Canadians, of course, have migrated to Canada, working on our railways and making a significant contribution to Canada, one of our major source countries for immigrants, and particularly now for foreign students. India, I think, is at the top of the list there. So the people-to-people ties are very significant. The Indo-Canadian population is almost 5% of our population, people who can claim roots back to India. So that part of the relationship is pretty good. The trading relationship is something we've been constantly working to improve. We've been negotiating a closer comprehensive economic relationship since 2010. That's not gone the way we had hoped it would. And I think largely because we find at the end of the day, India tends to be protectionist, often around agriculture, but also around some of the manufacturing goods. But still, the trade has grown with India, and would know more about the agricultural side of it. It is important for us. Certainly, I think that part of the world is still the biggest buyers of our pulse, for example.
Yeah.
In terms of the political relationship, so I say it started off pretty well. We provided India with the technology through a Candu reactor, but then India broke what we thought were pretty ironclad guarantees and used the nuclear, the extracted from the Candu reactor to create its own nuclear weapon, which they exploded back in the 70s. And at that point, the relationship went into the doldrums. And then in the 80s, things got a bit tough again with the Air India explosion, which the Indian authorities have always been concerned about the activities of particularly those Sikh Canadians. And actually, the largest group of Sikhs outside of India are in Canada. They're members of and they're good citizens and members of our cabinet. In fact, I think under the Harper cabinet and the early Trudeau governments, there were more Sikhs in the Canadian cabinet than there were in the Indian cabinet, which just goes to underline the deep, again, people-to-people ties, particularly from the Punjab. But Indian authorities have been concerned for a long time about what they call separatist activities by those who want to see an independent Palestine. And they have pressed the Canadian authorities to take action. And successive high commissioners to Canada from India have spoken to me about this and said that we don't take this seriously enough. For them, the closest I could compare it would be like the FLQ in Quebec and their activities back in the 70s in Canada. They say that on a large scale takes place in India, and a lot of it inspired from Canada. And so they have been pressuring us for some time to take action. And some things seem to have gone beyond the pale. For example, at a parade in Surrey, there was one of the floats was basically extolling the assassins of Indira Gandhi, the former Indian prime minister. And the Indians felt that we were simply not taking this seriously enough. So I think that that's a piece of this, but that doesn't mitigate the fact that the Indian authorities, again, I think there's now clear evidence, have gone way beyond their remit by encouraging and efforts to try and contain this, which gone as far as they say, assassination of Sikh Canadians, including home robberies and extortion and things which simply just should not take place. And so the decision by the government to send home the Indian High Commissioner and 6 senior diplomats, in which India has responded in kind by sending 6 of our diplomats packing, I think that's it's unfortunate. The whole point of having diplomats is to try and solve problems. And so when you send your diplomats away, how are you going to solve the problems? And the India-Canada relationship is important, particularly to Canada. I think the Indians probably don't put the same weight on the relationship that we do with India, but they see themselves as kind of coming superpower. They're now the most populous country in the world, and certainly under Prime Minister Modi, they have achieved a level of significance, particularly given the shifting, changing in geopolitics and the strategic challenges between the United States and China, with India playing a critical role in, of course, the Indo-Pacific, which is now the theater where the United States really does want to put its emphasis on. But there are, of course, distractions like Ukraine and Gaza and now the wider Middle East.
Mm-hmm. So that I've heard it described in these few days since Monday's announcement. India has its sights on the U.S. Canada has had its sights on China. And so somewhere in this mix, there is this also very important trade relationship. And as you mentioned, people-to-people relationship between Canada and India that maybe has not been in focus, perhaps. We did have the announcement of the Indo-Pacific strategy announced in 2022. We've got, an office that's been set up there. Is that in jeopardy now, do you think? Have we potentially sort of shot ourselves in the foot, or is trade viewed sort of somewhat separately from the diplomatic relations?
Unfortunately not. I think the relationship, the political relationship, has become glacial, and that will have implications for the trading relationship. As you point out, the Indo-Pacific strategy, which was 5 years in the making, and it has basically 4 pillars. There's the China pillar, which is also glacial because the relationship with China, following the events with the 2 Michaels, has never really recovered, despite best efforts, especially given more recent allegations of Chinese political interference in our domestic elections. The second pillar, of course, with India, well, that's in the icebox too, ever since the Prime Minister Trudeau got up in the House of Commons earlier this year to accuse the Indian government of complicity in the assassination of the Sikh Canadian leader in Vancouver, Mr. Niger. And then the latest allegations about further involvement in various activities. So that's tough. We've got the relationship with ASEAN, and we have the relationship with North North Asia, Korea, Japan, and to some degree Taiwan, which is moving along. But the two principal pillars, because they are the two biggest countries, is in really is not going anywhere. And I think it's a reflection in part, in some no small part, that I don't think China or India puts a lot of weight on the Canada relationship. We put much higher weight on the relationships with those two countries than they do with us. So I think they kind of figure they can treat us the way they want to, which is unfortunate because it has implications, as you point out, for our trading relationship. These are two countries with whom we have a trading relationship. We would like to broaden that trading relationship. Mr. Trudeau, when he first came to power, had approached the Chinese about a Canada-China free trade agreement, but that broke down when the Chinese simply rejected out of hand any elements of labor or human rights or environmental considerations in a trade agreement. And with the Indians, as I say, the challenge has been what we would see as Indian protectionism, and in a variety of facets, despite our best efforts to have a closer relationship. There is significant Canadian investment in India, but we have the investment protection agreement. We don't yet have the kind of larger comprehensive economic agreement that we would like. These negotiations started really going back to Paul Martin and under Prime Minister Stephen Harper and under Mr. Trudeau, but they haven't worked out.
Now, and I want to come back to the trade overall, sort of Canada's place in the world and with the US as well. But on this India file, and I think, you know, setting aside how many Canadians feel about Prime Minister Trudeau, you know, realistically, the RCMP coming forward with the evidence that they have, I think that all of us can agree that when there is extortion, murder, we have a criminal justice system for a reason, and it should be upheld. That being said, and as you've related, we are decades of a complicated, potentially, relationship with, you know, what happens on Canadian soil and the people that are here with ties back to India. Is there a path forward here that is clear as far as these governments being able to talk to each other, to work together, to repair this relationship?
Well, Lindsay, right now it's clear that we have major differences, and it's also clear that without having our principal diplomats in place, we're not going to make progress. And I always think it's highly unfortunate when governments withdraw, especially their ambassadors, because their ambassadors are the one individual who understand the country in which they are based and can provide intelligence and advice back to the Prime Minister. But if both of those individuals are not there, very hard for us to make progress. You end up having to do what we did a couple of weeks ago, where our national security advisor and the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, I think, flew to Singapore to meet with Indian authorities to try and work this through in a classic diplomatic fashion. You do this quietly behind the scenes. The Indians chose to make it public, and so we then made it public as well. So there will be negotiations, efforts to negotiate. We have such deep people-to-people ties that it won't be that hard for us to find individuals who can speak to the governments. But for now, it's in some ways it's quite unprecedented. It's one thing to have poor relations with a dictatorship like a China or a Russia, but with a fellow democracy and Commonwealth member, I haven't seen this. I can't think of a situation where I've seen it break down to this extent where we've thrown out the principal representatives on both sides. Although my read is that our current ambassador, Cameron McKay, is still there, that Indians sent home our deputy high commissioner, who in fact had been reassigned to become our ambassador in Argentina, Stuart Wheeler.
All right, Colin, thank you so much. This has been absolutely fantastic and fascinating. I do appreciate your time. Thank you for joining me on the show.
Thanks, Lindsay. My pleasure.